Throughout military history, there is one universal law that generals ignore at their own peril. Do not invade Russia in the winter. Centuries later, the freezing, apocalyptic snows of the Eurasian steppe would break the backs of Napoleon's Grande Armée and freeze the gears of the German Wehrmacht. For most of human history, winter in Kievan Rus was an impenetrable fortress. When the temperatures plummeted below zero and the blizzards blinded the horizon, warfare simply stopped. Armies hunkered down, built fires, and prayed they wouldn't starve before the spring thaw. But in the winter of 1237, the princes of Kievan Rus looked out into the freezing whiteout and saw something that defied logic. An army of over 100,000 men was not just surviving in the sub-zero wasteland. They were moving faster than any army in history. They weren't fighting the winter, they had weaponized it. Commanded by the legendary general Subutai, the Mongol Empire was about to execute the only successful winter conquest of Russia in recorded history. And they did it by turning the deadliest environment on Earth into their greatest tactical advantage. To understand how the Mongols achieved the impossible, you have to look at the men themselves. A European knight of the 13th century was heavily armored in chainmail and iron, metals that conduct cold directly to the skin, turning armor into a freezing death trap. The Mongol warrior was engineered entirely differently. He was born on the Mongolian steppe, a high-altitude plateau where winter temperatures routinely dropped to -40 degrees. For him, the Russian winter wasn't an anomaly. It was Tuesday. His survival depended on a sophisticated layering system. At the base, against the skin, many warriors wore a shirt of tightly woven raw silk. This wasn't for luxury. Silk doesn't tear easily when pierced by a broadhead arrow. It wraps around the arrowhead, allowing the warrior to pull the arrow cleanly out of his flesh without leaving splintered shards behind. Over the silk, the warrior wore a deal, a heavy, calf-length tunic made of wool or leather, overlapping across the chest for double insulation. But the outer layer was the true lifesaver. Thick coats of wolf, fox, or sheepskin, worn with the fur facing inward against the body to trap a microclimate of heat. Their boots were made of dense felt and leather, lined with fur, and greased with animal fat to make them completely waterproof against the deep snow. While European soldiers froze in their rigid metal plates, the Mongol warrior was a mobile furnace, insulated, flexible, and completely unaffected by the plunging temperatures. But an army is only as mobile as its logistics, and here is where the European armies always failed. Traditional European war horses were massive grain-fed beasts. When the winter snows covered the pastures, these horses starved unless the army carried thousands of tons of oats and hay with them, an impossible logistical nightmare. The Mongols didn't ride massive chargers. They rode the Mongolian steppe pony. Do not let the word pony fool you. These were rugged, shaggy, muscular beasts that were semi-wild and phenomenally aggressive. More importantly, they were biologically adapted to the Ice Age. When the snows piled up in Kievan Rus, the Mongol horses didn't need grain carts. They had a unique instinct European horses lacked. They knew how to use their hard front hooves to smash through thick ice and dig deep into the snow to graze on the frozen, dead grass buried underneath. They were entirely self-sufficient. Every Mongol warrior brought a string of 3 to 5 horses, rotating them constantly, so no single animal was ever ridden to exhaustion. If a blizzard struck and no food could be found, the warrior could survive by making a small incision in the horse's neck, drinking a few ounces of its nutrient-rich blood, sealing the wound and riding on. This meant the Mongol supply chain didn't exist in wagons trailing slowly behind the army. The supply chain was the army. They moved at terrifying speeds, up to 60 miles a day, in conditions where a normal army would struggle to move 5. The princes of Kievan Rus thought their geography would protect them. The land was dominated by dense, impenetrable forests and deep, winding rivers. In the summer, moving a massive army through this terrain was a slow, muddy nightmare, bottlenecked by bridges and narrow forest tracks. But Subutai, the greatest military mind of his generation, looked at the winter map and saw an entirely different board. When the temperatures dropped and the deep rivers of Russia, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, froze solid, they ceased to be obstacles. The ice became several feet thick, strong enough to support the weight of tens of thousands of galloping horses and heavy siege engines. Subutai turned the frozen rivers into high-speed superhighways. Instead of slogging through the woods, the Mongol columns flew down these flat, frictionless paths of ice, striking deep into the heart of Russian territory before the defenders even knew they had crossed the border. The rivers connected directly to the major cities. The Russians had built their fortresses on the riverbanks for trade and defense. Now, those same rivers delivered the apocalypse right to their front gates. In December 1237, the Mongol horde appeared like a ghost army out of the freezing fog before the wooden walls of Ryazan. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Igorevich, refused to surrender, believing his high walls and the brutal cold would break the siege. He assumed the Mongols would have to camp in the snow and eventually freeze or starve. He was wrong. The Mongols didn't just survive the siege, they accelerated it. Because the ground was frozen solid, the Mongols couldn't easily dig standard siege trenches. Instead, they built a massive wooden palisade completely surrounding the city in a matter of days, trapping the defenders inside. Then, they brought up their engineers, thousands of conscripts from China and Persia, experts in advanced siege warfare. Through the blinding snow, the terrifying sound of mechanical artillery echoed across the ice. The Mongols unleashed a relentless bombardment of heavy stones, incendiary weapons, and flaming naphtha from their catapults and trebuchets. The freezing winds only fanned the flames, catching the wooden roofs of Ryazan on fire. The defenders were forced to fight the blazing inferno inside their city, while enduring the freezing temperatures and the endless rain of armor-piercing arrows from outside. After just 6 days of relentless, freezing terror, the walls were breached. Ryazan was annihilated. The Mongols slaughtered the population, leaving nothing but smoking ash settling on the bloody snow. The destruction of Ryazan was just the beginning. Using the frozen rivers, Subutai's armies spread out like a shattered glass, simultaneously striking Kolomna, Moscow, and Vladimir. The psychological warfare was absolute. The Russian armies were completely paralyzed. In a normal war, you relied on scouts to warn you of an approaching enemy. But how do you scout an enemy that moves 60 miles a day through a blinding whiteout? By the time the defenders saw the dark shapes of the Mongol horsemen emerging from the blizzard, it was already too late. The Mongols proved that extreme environments don't dictate the outcome of a war. Adaptability does. They took the very thing that was supposed to destroy them, the mythical Russian winter, and forged it into a weapon that allowed them to conquer the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They didn't just survive the cold, they became the storm.